what we've turned tonight is more about a conversation about intergenerational wealth. So we thought it'd be great to have them sitting on stools and having a bit of a conversation. So, yeah, good. So I'd like to introduce Tony Bates is our wealth advisor within Accounting Professionals. Mark Classic's our head of wealth, our partner in our firm. So I'm going to pass over to Mark, who's going to lead the conversation.
Thanks, Gary, for that welcome and introduction, and thanks everyone for coming tonight. I guess, as Gary pointed out, really what we want to talk about is maximising the wealth of the family unit, and regardless of the generation, and not necessarily doing it the way that these guys do it, but through good sound advice. And that's something that Tony's been involved in for the better part of his career, about working with families in relation to their intergenerational wealth. So I'll sort of start by asking you Tony, what your experiences have been working in that area with families.
Yeah, look, the truth is that every family is different. Have we got the slide? Yeah. So every family is different. Not all families want to pass wealth on to their children too early. Not all families want to pass their wealth on to their children at all. They might be philanthropists. So the point is that every family is different, and relationships within families are very different. But it is a conversation that should be had. And some of you may have seen a blog I wrote a few weeks ago. Families are quite happy talking about, they all watch Gogglebox together. They like seeing relationships. They like seeing sex and drugs and rock and roll. But they actually don't talk about the M word. We saw the F word, but the money word. And it's not a conversation that comes up easily. And so with a third party, with a good accountant and a trusted advisor, you can start to have that conversation. And that's really what we want to drill down into today.
Yeah, and I guess, when we're starting this conversation with a client, it all starts with a plan. And the best plans are considered with the end in mind. So we really need to start about, well, what do we want the outcome to be? So when we're looking at planning with clients, what makes a good plan, and why do you think they're important?
Well, we use the wording roadmap because if you looked up Dr. Google and just asked for what's the best plan to get from A to B, it's the same answer regardless. But the truth is, we don't know where B is until we start the conversation. So you've got to start the conversation with, well, where do you want to be? Where are you heading? And when do you want to get there? And these are questions about, well, when do I want my children to potentially benefit in my wealth? Or when do I want to retire? How much of my own wealth that I'm creating do I want to spend while I'm creating it on my own lifestyle? Or do I want to actually put more away for myself when I'm in retirement? So every client has a different plan, but it's about asking the right questions and sitting down and actually starting to look at the impact of some of the decisions you can make to start formulating that plan. And the plan is personal to you, it's personal to a couple, and sometimes it involves other family members.
And just sort of coming back to having that end in mind, certainly my experience has been with clients is that everyone has a different goal. The goals look different to different families. And, that might be passing wealth down, or keeping on it and spending it, enjoying retirement. In discussions that we have with clients, what sort of goals are common?
Boats, travel. They say that the two best days of owning a boat is the day you buy it and the day you sell it. We get some wonderful goals like get rich, get richer, get richer still, or buy a property, buy a second property, and then buy a portfolio of properties. There's lots of goals that come out. I think goal setting is a really important part of it, and I tend to leave that for the meeting. We tend to leave it for the meeting. And, it's a very personal thing, but certainly spending money, certainly making a difference, certainly helping family members. Lots and lots of 40-year-olds are recognising that their own children may never get into the property market. And that's front of mind. What can I do during my successful career to help my children? The goals are all very different, but by getting the goal, you get focus. You get a purpose. And once you've got the purpose, then you can build a plan around that.
And I guess, one of the most common questions we get asked is, am I going to run out of money? And there's tools that we can use to paint a picture that will give some area of comfort as to whether or not that's going to happen. But yeah, some people have a goal that they don't want to be relying on the age pension, that they want to be self-funded retirees. And some clients want to pass some assets on to the children. Some clients might want to just pass the income from assets onto a children and keep control of the asset themselves. And then you've got life events.
Life gets in the way of a good plan, illness can happen. A child can go off the rails. All sorts of things can happen. So it's not just about having the plan; it's about protecting that plan. It's about if you're building your assets, you're building your business, you're building your income, you're putting away money into super. Things can happen along the way. I have daughters. They're called weddings. They're expensive. I should have planned better.
The common ones there are providing for education, or it might be to assist children get into the property market, as we sort of mentioned. So when we talk about transitioning wealth, I guess, and everybody in the room is probably at a different stage of their journey at the moment, but we actually have to start with actually creating something to give. So, what are the different strategies that we can use to assist clients in growing their wealth?
The biggest one of all is spend less than you earn, put some away. And we talk about putting some money away to give you capacity for next week or 3 months, making sure you're not living hand to mouth. Then we talk about the sort of longer term, the medium term, and then we talk about you in retirement after you stop working. So you should be allocated to all three potentially, subject to capacity. But what you want to do is maximise flexibility before you retire, but you don't want to forget retirement because the superannuation system in Australia is unbelievably generous. So you should be putting that away. The main one is spending less than you're earning. The second one is investing, whether it's in property, whether it's in some other kind of asset class, I'm not so concerned. But if you leave it in the bank, there's a rule of 72, which I often say with clients. 9% return will double in 8 years. 9 times 8 is 72. A 6% return will double in 12 years. A 2.7% return, forget it. Don't sit in the bank. So you've got to think about capital growth. You've got to have assets where the income rises. And if the income rises, the rents rise, the dividends rise, the asset price will look after itself. But you need to have your capital grow above inflation.
I guess the other asset that quite often gets overlooked as part of a plan is clients that have their own businesses. Your business is an asset. It's generating income for you. It has the potential to either be sold down the track or at least transition to the next generation. And there needs to be a focus on that area as well. And the government have made it quite a number of concessions around allowing for the sale of the business to end up in the right structure, I guess.
Yeah, to end up in super. People who have not been able to put money away into super and accumulated their assets in their business, there's concessions to get that money into superannuation. It's an acknowledgement that the great wealth of Australia has been grown in small businesses. And I can tell you that in my experience of 30 years of dealing with fairly wealthy people, most of them made money by selling a business, not by working for someone in a business.
You mentioned before when talking to clients about their 3 pots of money. Would you like to just talk a little bit more about what that entails and what the strategies are around each of the different pots?
Yep, so often there's a couple, so that's the first thing, and often the member of the couple that pays the bills and is concerned about tomorrow, we make sure that person, often a woman, but not necessarily, the person who's more worried about today, we have mortgage offset accounts, we make sure there's enough cash. Got to have enough cash sitting in that person's control. So that's the today money. And that's the lowest risk money. That should sit in cash. Lowest risk, lowest reward, but available at all times. Then obviously the other end of the scale is, 30 years from now when we retire, I always encourage clients to think about dialing up the risk, regardless of their risk profile. if the time horizon is long enough, and it's not just about the day you retire, it's actually about the day you die, the time horizon can be 30, 40, 50 years, you should dial up the risk and reward in your superannuation pot and then stop looking at it. And then in the medium term, which is basically from the age you are today to the day you can access your superannuation benefits, which is a different age for everybody, you should certainly be trying to grow wealth. And you can use leverage, you can use flexibility through the use of family trusts. There may be opportunities to put money outside a family trust and into pots of money for the children to help pay their education or raise a deposit. We've got strategies around that. But again, that's the flexible money. That's the money that in emergencies, if you need access to capital, you need to keep that flexibility.
And I guess the way that we structure those, or the way that we hold those three different pots in terms of structure is really important as well. The retirement money clearly is best structured in the superannuation environment. We're subject to a low tax rate, a flat rate of 15 cents in the dollar. And then once we start drawing a pension down from our fund, that goes to zero. So for the retirement pot, superannuation as a structure works really well. And that's, when we're talking about plans with clients, there's certainly a heavy emphasis on making sure that that pot of money is in the superannuation structure. If we're looking at the today money, typically those assets are going to be very liquid, quite often, as Tony mentioned, cash, little return on investments. There's no real reason why they aren't typically held in the individual person's name. So it's a cheap structure. It's simple as holding something in a bank account, and the tax implications are quite negligible, meaning that the returns are quite small. The tomorrow money is a little bit more complicated. We tend to see as a family trust is a really good vehicle to hold that pot of money. It allows us to distribute the earnings or the income that we make to beneficiaries that have low tax rates, and we can change that from year to year. So there might be a particular year where one of our beneficiaries in our family group, and if we're talking about a holistic intergenerational family group, someone may not be working, they might be on their gap year overseas, they might have been out of the workforce because they're starting a family. Family trusts give us a lot of flexibility to distribute income that those investments are earning to the person with the lowest marginal tax rate. So in terms of structuring, there's different structures that we use for each of those pots of money. So we have a plan now. We've started accumulating our wealth, and I think the most important thing that we need to turn to is how do we start protecting it? Because we want to make sure that we want this to be a legacy, and we want it to be there to transition to our children. So I guess the pictures that we've got up on the slide above look at what are the things that we're trying to protect against, and the first one there quite obviously is tax, and that goes to the point that I made previously. We want to make sure that our assets are in a structure that's going to minimise the amount of tax we pay, not only going forward on the earnings that we're making off those investments, but also when it becomes time to sell. So when we're looking at protection, we want to protect ourselves from tax, and we use legal structures to do that. The second one there is our tradie friend, and he represents a business. And we want to protect our investment money from ourselves or from our own businesses. We don't want to see, if our business gets in trouble, we don't want to see creditors being able to access our investment money. So the strategy around there that we would typically use is make sure that we have the business structured in one particular entity and our investments held in another entity, so that they're protected. The investment assets are protected from the creditors of the business, and quite often the business premises for a lot of clients, and that's a significant asset, will be held in the structure with the investments rather than the structure with the business. And again, that's to protect that asset in case anything goes wrong with the business. The third one there is meant to depict an outsider, and I'll pass over to Tony to talk a little bit about outsiders and what we can do to protect against outsiders. And first and foremost, who are they?
Well, they can obviously be someone suing you, so the sort of family trust structure. They can be that son-in-law you don't like, who's been mean to your daughter and is after her money. It looks like the son-in-law. It's anyone from outside the family is the short answer, and obviously getting the family money in the right family structure where someone who's under threat doesn't own the asset but just has the potential access to the benefits. I think it's at the end of the day, you've got to avoid people like that. But if you're trying to keep the money in the family, then there are certainly things you can do.
Yeah, the fourth one that we've got there is a wheelchair. Really represents a disruption for income to our income. So that could be in the event of an accident where we're temporarily off work. It could be something more permanent, a permanent disability where we're still alive. And really what we want to do is we want to make sure that in the event of a disruption to our income, that we can continue to execute our plan. So we don't want the plan to fall over because our income source has stopped. So typically we would use insurance for this purpose, income protection insurance, TPD insurance, and also trauma insurance. And that allows us to continue down our path, even in the event that we're not earning our income. And then we move on to the final one, literally the final one, which is death. And how do we protect against death? Clearly you can't protect from a wealth perspective against dying. But what we can protect against is making sure that our assets go to the right person at the right time with the least amount of tax payable. And that ties back to our estate plan. And our estate plan should be structured in a way that our assets get to the right people at the right time, and minimising tax. In relation to estate plans, there's a separate structure that we can use there, which is very tax effective, which is called a testamentary trust. Testamentary trusts operate a little bit like a family trust, whereby the assets of the deceased person fall into a trust, but that trust has certain tax concessions, and it's really advantageous, particularly where we want to distribute income to children that are under 18. Children that are under 18 normally pay tax on any income that they earn over $416, and this is investment income, at the top marginal rate. With a testamentary trust, the income that they earn through the distribution of income from that trust is taxed at adult rates. So what that means is they get the first $20,000 tax-free, and then they go to the 19 cents in the dollar rate, and so on and so forth. So a testamentary trust, particularly where there's a significant or a reasonable amount of wealth involved in the estate, probably upwards of $500,000 to $1 million, is a really valuable tool as part of protecting that family wealth. The other thing that I'd point out is that there are other assets that don't form their way into the estate. So if we're holding an asset in a family trust, well, that family trust is going to continue after death, which has its positives and its negatives. But the point there is that it falls outside the will or the estate. So the family trust is designed to go beyond the life, arguably, of the person that's created it. The second point to raise there is around superannuation, and superannuation by default also doesn't form part of your estate. It gets dealt with separately by the trustee of the super fund. Now, what often happens with clients is they direct the trustee of the super fund while they're alive to pay their benefit to their estate. So then it gets dealt with as part of the will, and then we can start taking advantages of that testamentary trust structure. Tony often refers as a testamentary trust will as a gift to your children.
Free option. It's an extra gift in the will. If ultimately they get to maturity and they are trustee of their own testamentary trust and they don't want it anymore, they can get rid of it. But it enables you as a parent to decide when your child's going to have access to income and then separately to capital. And think of it as that free option, that free gift. It's an extra gift because it does ultimately do what all family trusts do, which is protect family money to the family.
And particularly important to beneficiaries that might be operating their own businesses or in high-risk professions. Technically, the assets in that testamentary trust aren't theirs, so there's a certain element of protection from creditors there. So it's a really valuable tool and really does form part of that overall protection of the family wealth. So, moving on, we've now got our wealth, we've worked out how we can protect it. The $64,000 question, I guess, then becomes, when's the right time to start the transition process? And my first point there is that death is going to start the transition process. But quite often the process will be started before that.
Yeah, and this comes back to the family conversation. This is really where, baby boomer parents can decide all this with a good advisor and good accountants. But it's better to involve, I believe, adult children in the process. After all, they could be the ones that are booking your aged care accommodation. I just think families should understand, and particularly if there's a family business, the transition should start sooner rather than later. I guess over my career, I've seen it go horribly wrong, these conversations. So, you can have the conversation by yourself, but I've been brought in, and I'm sure Mark's been brought in many times over, where an independent third party can broker these quite sensitive conversations, but they can be educational and they can be incredibly helpful. And families should spend time as grandparents and as at the family dinner table, not necessarily having to sort of have angst over some of these issues. And by bringing a third party in, I've found these conversations are not so hard to have and are important to have.
Yeah, and I guess, the time of transition goes right back to your plan. You'll start the transition process as part of your original plan, and that could be providing money for education. You started the transition process. It's providing money for a deposit on the house as start of the part of the transition process. So quite often the right time is to go back and to refer to the plan, and it will, quite clearly point out or remind you of what your intentions were. I guess the other thing that we hear from clients, financial maturity of their children is quite often very important. That is often a trigger for when clients start to think about when the right time is. But there are also some tax considerations to think of, and probably the two main ones that come to mind are superannuation, and it's a little bit a de facto death duty, but if a person was to pass away and their superannuation money was to find its way to their children, they'd be taxed on 15% of the money that they receive. So there's a taxing point that comes in when superannuation money is passed down, not to your spouse, but to your adult children. So in the case of superannuation, you were to withdraw your money out of super prior to passing away and then stick the money in your bank account and it was to find its way to your children, there'd be no tax. Whereas if that happened in the event of your death, then there's the potential for up to 15% in tax there. So superannuation particularly is an important one around the timing, and we can't all predict our death. That's the challenging part, I guess. But there are a number of strategies that we can put in place to minimise the impact. The second one, I guess, is in relation to transferring property, and it could be that there's either an investment property or residence, and the intention is that property is to be transferred to the children. And in that scenario, it's better doing that transfer after death. If you were to make the transfer prior to death, we've got stamp duty implications, and we're also realising a capital gain. Whereas if we're doing it and the transfer is part of an estate, well, then we get to defer the capital gain, and there's some stamp duty concessions there. So that's two different examples where As part of the plan, we'd look to maybe looking at transitioning our super prior to death, whereas when it comes to property, potentially after death is a better way of doing it. Certainly my experience sitting down with clients is there's a lot of fear around this transition process. And Tony, coming back to you, what sort of fears, I guess, do you see when we're talking to clients about starting that process?
Yeah, look, I think longevity risk, running out of money, is probably the big one. You know, if I help them now, what if I run out of money? And we're living a lot longer. You know, we're retiring at 65 perhaps, but we're living to 95. So running out of money is the big one. I think the other one is just about their confidence in their children. You know, when is financial maturity? You know, when is the right... I mean, people got married at 21 and bought their first house at 23. That's not the truth today. And, you know, there is a fear that people are starting families, forming families later and squandering money in between. So I think that comes up a lot. That is it 25? Is it 28? Is it 30? Certainly 28 is a number that comes up a lot as an appropriate time to start assisting an adult into the property market or assisting them to form a family. There's always, you know, the risk of a bad relationship, a risk of a failed business in the next generation. Parents do worry about that a lot. And that, you know, how can you help your child buy a property? They're now an adult, they're in a relationship, they may have even had their first child. Should you give them the money? Should you go joint tenants with them? Or should you lend them the money? And in most cases, the right answer is lend the money, because there's an asset and a loan. And if that's clearly documented, and trust me, I went through this, and I went through a divorce, and I had a loan from my parents, and it stood up in court. There's a loan and an asset. And so if there's a bad relationship, the leaving spouse only has a share in the net equity, not in the whole value of the property. So going joint tenants with your children is creating a capital gain, whereas if the children had it as their principal place of residence, there wouldn't be one. So a loan is better.
Yeah, and that's probably the point that I was just about to make, is that certainly from a tax point of view, loaning the money is far better than purchasing a property and letting your child live in there as if it's theirs, particularly around, you know, the capital gains. They don't get the main residence exemption and those sort of things. You referred to one of your more recent blogs, and we might organise to get that posted up on our Facebook page, because it is actually quite an entertaining read. And you mentioned that families should talk more about money, and to me this goes hand in hand with the transition process, and something that you've had a lot of experience in. I'm a big advocate for sitting down and having that family meeting and knowing what's on the table. Obviously, it needs to be done at the right time, and you need to be comfortable in doing that, but it certainly has its advantages. More to the point that it starts to prepare the children for what might be coming. Yeah, I guess, you know, there are a couple of ways that you can incorporate the children in, or the next generation, the second generation, into the family wealth story, and part of that is to get them involved in the decision making along the way, not necessarily owning the assets, but understanding what goes on with meetings with advisors and accountants and solicitors, and get them involved in the process, not necessarily handing the keys over to them, but gradually, I guess, training them up so that one day you will be able to hand over it, and they will have, you know, a well-rounded education of how to deal with this money. Now, the money that you're talking about in your example is a lot bigger, but the principles are the same.
I'll jump in with one. My own mum has tried to help her own grandchildren. My children aren't quite at the age yet, so she's put aside $50,000 for each grandchild. But each grandchild has to raise the $50,000 and she'll match it dollar for dollar. So there's lesson number one. Brilliant, don't you love it? So if you raise $30,000, you get $30,000. When you raise $50,000, you get $50,000. But the piece I really liked is she then, you know, twisted our arms as in generation 2, and said, you match $50,000. So that child can actually leverage up the savings of $50,000 to $150,000. Now that is a deposit on a house. So, there are things you can do. And if you talk to an accountant and a financial planner, they've seen what works and what doesn't work. So, what works for one family may not work for your family, but at least if you get someone with experience in, you can sort of think through some of the options.
And look, in an ideal world, your children should have their own financial plan. But when they're preparing their plan and looking at their goals, there also should be some consideration as to how they fit into your plan as well. And then overall, you'll get a stronger outcome. So I think that's really important. But again, it comes down to communication. It comes down to teaching, understanding the concept of the value of money and that sort of stuff. It's really, really important.
And the thing that can go wrong, obviously, also is if you don't talk to them and you die, and the 3 kids inherit your home, and you thought that they'd all agree, don't assume that they will if you haven't had that conversation beforehand.
So, sort of in summary, I think when we're looking at the transition process and the best way to transition. For me, it comes down to the 4 key concepts, and the first one being this: that you have to have your goals. Your goals can change as time goes on, and as Tony said, the plan is a roadmap. It can change as life goes in different directions, but it's important that you have those goals in order to create purpose, and it really financially it becomes the document that you live your life by. Second, once we've got our goals in place, then comes the strategy, and the strategy is all about growing our wealth, structuring our wealth. And then we must start to move on to the transition phase, and that's around education and probably more importantly, communication.
I often quote Warren Buffett, and one of the things he said about his own children was he wanted to ensure that they had enough to do whatever they wanted, but not so much that they could do nothing. And I think that's such a good line.